Okay, so one thing you guys mentioned that you wanted help with was deconstructing a passage. So I thought I would pull up the Wolsey passage, or the FRQ you did most recently, and kind of walk through and think aloud about how I would break it down, how I would figure it out, to kind of help you see, one, how I would annotate it, but also how I kind of wrap my brain around each of the different ideas. So I'm going to start with the prompt. While I know we're just talking about deconstructing passages and really reading them for understanding, it's always good to read as much of the prompt as you can to get some sort of insight into the context. So, in the following speech from Shakespeare's play, Henry VIII, Cardinal Wolsey considers his sudden downfall from his position as advisor to the king. So the first things that I kind of think of in that are, one, it's medieval times. If we're talking about, I did not spell that right, but if we're talking about Henry VIII, right? Shakespeare, I'm familiar with the verse format and things like that. And also, this word cardinal, one thought that I had when I saw that is that's a religious official in the Catholic Church. So those are just kind of my first observations, and all of those kind of play as part of the context. Spokesmen for the king, I'm continuing reading now. Spokesmen for the king have just left Wolsey alone on stage. So he's alone. That's relevant. No one else is hearing this except for him. Read the speech carefully, then write a well-organized essay in which you analyze how Shakespeare uses elements such as allusion, figurative language, and tone to convey Wolsey's complex response. So when we're looking at passages in this context, we can look at the task to kind of focus our reading process. And in this case, we're focusing on his response, particularly to the fact that he's essentially been fired. So getting as much as I can from the prompt before I go in so I know really what's happening. So let's dig in. I'm going to make my pen just a little bit smaller so that we can write on the passage a little neater. It says, "So farewell to the little good you bear me." This phrase already kind of jumps out at me. It makes me think of when people say to each other, like, little good you, like what good are you? You didn't do anything to help me. So immediately I'm getting a sense that he's kind of bitter. So farewell to the little good you bear me. Farewell. A long farewell to all my greatness. A long farewell to all my greatness. So we all know what farewell means, or goodbye to all my greatness. So he's kind of a little bit arrogant is my impression of that line. If he's saying like arrogant, but he's lost his greatness. So it's kind of already showing a complicated feeling because he thinks he is great, but he's suddenly lost it. This is the state of man. Today he puts forth the tender leaves of hope. Tomorrow blossoms and bears his blushing honors thick upon him. So with poetry, I think one thing is it's really important to read to the end of the sentence, not to stop where the commas are, but look for semicolons and periods, exclamation points, because that's where the thought actually ends. So in that context, looking at this, from here to here, he says, this is the state of man. So he's kind of leading in, and now he's going to describe what the state of man is. And state of man just means like this is the situation, right? And then it says, today he puts forth the tender leaves of hope. Tomorrow blossoms and bears his blushing honors thick upon him. So we have three words in here that kind of all create this plant image. Leaves are obviously a part of plants. Blossoms are parts of flowers. And bears, like a plant bears fruit, all kind of start creating this imagery that's related to plants. So he says, the tender leaves of hope. Tomorrow blossoms and bears his blushing honors thick upon him. So if we're talking about the tender leaves of hope, it's creating a relationship between this plant image and hope. So essentially, hope is like a plant. That's what I've gotten from those two lines. And then it might have been confusing when it says, and bears his blushing honors thick upon him. when you lay something thick, so think about, I don't know if you've heard this expression, but laying it on thick is referring to like over exaggerating, or it's, if you're thinking about the actual image that that phrase comes from, like if you're creating a peanut butter jelly sandwich and you put the peanut butter on really thick, it just means there's a lot of it. So in this case, he's had a lot of honors laid upon him, which ties into that idea of greatness. So he talks about hope. Like I said, I'm going to highlight that because that's a key idea so far. And he talks about how his greatness and his hopefulness have been like a plant. So then let's move on to this line. The third day comes a frost, a killing frost, and when he thinks, good easy man, full surely his greatness is a ripening, nips his root, and then he falls, as I do. So again, big strategy with Shakespeare. Read to the end of the sentence, not the end of the line, because it won't make sense. But if we look at it this way, the third day, so 3 days later, right, comes a frost. This is, again, connecting back to our plant image, but it's also a shift, right? A frost, a killing frost. So we went from this idea of, let me switch my colors here, hope, to now death. So what I can infer from that is that hope dies. And when he thinks, good easy man, full surely his greatness is a ripening, nips his root, and then he falls, as I do. So let's dig into this middle part here. When he says, good easy man. So another way to think about that is easygoing. What does it mean to be easygoing? Well, it means you're laid back. You're not worried about anything. That's referring back to where he said he was blushing with hope, that he was having these honors laid thick upon him, right? But now, when his greatness is a ripening, referring back to the greatness he started with at the beginning, he says, this frost nips his root. If you're not familiar with the word nips, think of the expression, nip it in the bud, which just means to end it, to get rid of it, right? And then he falls, as I do. So that's a really like word by word breakdown of this first part. But I'm going to tell you that with Shakespeare, that's not the impression that you really need. Because as I walk away from this, all I really need to know is, okay, he thought he was great, right? He was full of hope. He was easygoing. But ultimately, he fell. That is enough summary of these few lines to know what's going on in that part, okay? So if I were to, and I will go over here for this part, to summarize, he was, those first few lines, my greatness didn't get me far. Very far. I was full of hope and honored, but I fell because of a negative force. And when I say negative force, I'm just referring to the frost, right? And based on this, I'm getting this summary from these words that I've circled and highlighted. Just from those alone, I get this primary sentiment. So what I'm going to do in this next part of it is I'm just going to highlight some key words. And I'm going to show you a strategy for understanding passages that are difficult. Because what I've already noticed in this passage is there's a juxtaposition of good things and bad things. So I'm going to highlight the good in blue and the not so good in yellow and hope that from that I can figure out kind of the overall meaning of the passage. So, I have ventured like little wanton boys that swim on bladders, or floaties essentially, that many summers in a sea of glory. That's definitely positive. But far beyond my depth, my high-blown pride, there he's kind of criticizing himself, right? at length broke under me, and now has left me. Oops, wrong color. That would not be a positive thing. Being left is a negative thing. Weary and old with service, to the mercy of a rude stream that must forever hide me. Vain pomp and glory of this world, I hate ye. I feel my heart new open. So if your heart's opening up, that's not necessarily bad. Oh, how wretched is bad, is that poor man, that hangs on princes' favors. There is betwixt that smile is a positive thing, we would aspire to, that sweet aspect of princes and their ruin. Ruin would be negative, right? More pangs and fears than wars or women have. And when he falls like Lucifer, which has a negative connotation, never to hope again. So, if I'm picking out the words that I just understand, what I've highlighted are words I understand. Maybe not betwixt, okay? We can take out betwixt, but we can highlight that a smile is a positive thing, right? So what I'm noticing as I'm reading this is there is a general combination of good and bad. So when we're talking about a complex response up here, all I really need to say is that, you know what? He realizes that he lived a good life, but now faces challenges. So I could say his response is maybe nostalgic for that past where things were good, yet hurt. Now he's in a position where he has to face the pain of his dismissal. The biggest thing with kind of breaking down passages to make sure you understand them is that it's not about understanding every single word. But here are some strategies that I'm going to outline down here for you. Number one, paraphrasing or summarizing. So that's something I did for the first part. I read and I paraphrased what I could, right? Over here in the purple, I explained, okay, this is what I think he said. Before that even, another strategy I used for a difficult passage is finding connections. So in those first few lines, I have these circles, right? And the connections that are happening between them. I didn't necessarily have to understand every single line, but I can know that there is something happening between those concepts. A word is repeating, things like that. Another strategy that I mentioned is to read to the punctuation. Shakespeare definitely isn't going to make sense if you read to the end of the line, because the end of the line is not always the end of the sentence. That would be like if you were reading a paragraph and every time you came to the edge of the page, you just stopped. Of course it's not going to make sense. You don't have the complete thought. So we definitely need to read to the end punctuation or it's just not going to make sense. The next strategy, and this probably won't be that helpful, but if you know anything about grammar, you can use grammatic structures to help things make sense. So for example, with, where was it? This is the state of man. That ends with what's called a colon, right? It's kind of getting covered up. But I know that a colon is used to preface a list or to preface new information. And so that helped me know that he's going to go on and describe what is the state of man, because I know what a colon is. Now, if you don't know those things, that strategy isn't going to be particularly helpful, but it is something helpful in terms of understanding poetry better, okay? Other things I did were this positive, negative approach I used at the end. We kind of did this last year when we were talking about tone, right? It kind of goes up and down as you move through a passage. And what that does is that kind of gives you a better sense of what you should be looking for. Because if you have a whole bunch of positive words in a row, then you can understand that they're trying to express a good feeling in that part, that there's positive associations for a reason. But with this one, for example, we see a combination of the blue and yellow because we want to talk about complex reaction. So that combination kind of shows us that he's not just mad, he's not happy for sure, but it helps us kind of get a little bit more specific in terms of how he's feeling by looking at those words when they're combined and when we separate them out between positive and negative. So those are a few strategies that I would suggest when it comes to reading difficult passages, when it comes to reading Shakespeare. But Shakespeare in particular, it helps to listen, and it's okay to rely on listening a little bit just because that's how they were meant to be shown and seen. You need to remember that Shakespeare's plays were written for the lowest of the low as well as the highest of the high. People who had never even walked foot in any sort of school or learned anything enjoyed these plays, and that was because they could follow along the actor's expression and the movement. And so that is a huge part of really appreciating what Shakespeare is. Now, when we look at it on a piece of paper like this, I always think it helps to kind of take on the mindset of the actor. Like, how would I say these things? Well, just like an actor would, I'm going to think about how I read to the punctuation, not just line by line, because that's never going to make any sense. So those are a few strategies. I hope it helps. But honestly, the best way to get better at understanding complicated texts is to practice.